The first thing I noticed when I walked into Courtroom 14 was that Judge Harlan was wearing the same cufflinks my father had given him at my parents' 35th anniversary dinner. I recognized them because I'd wrapped the box. Brushed silver. Square face. Engraved with the letter H on one side and the number 35 on the other. For 35 years of friendship, my father had said when he handed them over at the table, with the kind of warmth he reserved for men who could be useful. Judge Harlan had laughed and put them on immediately, right there in the restaurant, while my mother photographed the moment and my brother Derek refilled everyone's wine. I had sat at the end of the table and eaten my salmon and said nothing, which was the role I had played in my family for most of my 34 years. I set my briefcase down beside my chair and took my seat next to my attorney, Dana Reeves. Dana is 61 years old, has silver hair she keeps cropped close, and wears reading glasses she is constantly removing and replacing as punctuation to her sentences. She has practiced estate and civil litigation law in Colorado for 33 years. She was my grandfather's attorney for the last 16 years of his life, and she is the sharpest person I have ever worked with, which is saying something because I work in financial compliance and spend my days with people who are paid specifically to be precise. "How are you doing?" she asked quietly, without looking up from her notes. "I'm fine," I said. "You don't have to be fine." "I know," I said. "I'm fine anyway." "My name is Claire Whitmore. I run a financial compliance consultancy in Denver, 19 employees, contracts with 4 regional banks and 2 federal credit unions, annual revenue just under $2.9 million. I own a 2-bedroom condo in Capitol Hill, drive a used Subaru with 87,000 miles on it, and keep a savings account I've had to rebuild 3 separate times after what my parents described as family emergencies turned out to be family choices in which I was the solution and not the beneficiary. My parents were suing me for $3.1 million. Across the aisle, my father sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him, the posture of a man who has decided the outcome before the proceedings begin. He was dressed in the navy suit he saved for occasions he considered important, the same suit he'd worn to my grandfather's funeral, I noticed, which I chose to read as unintentional. My mother sat beside him in a gray dress the color of old newsprint, and she was pressing a tissue to the corner of one eye, though from my angle I couldn't tell whether she was crying or simply performing the preparation for it. Their attorney, Gerald Fitch, was reviewing notes at the plaintiff's table with the efficient stillness of a man at the top of his profession. He billed $680 an hour. He had never lost a civil asset case, according to his firm's website. He had very good posture and the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from arrogance but from long experience of being right. I watched him for a moment and then looked away. Let me tell you about my grandfather, because none of the rest of this makes sense without him. Gerald Whitmore Sr. was born in Tucson in 1931, the third son of a hardware store owner who lost the store in 1938 and spent the remaining years of his life rebuilding a smaller version of it and calling that a life. My grandfather watched his father rebuild and learned 2 things: that you could lose everything and still find a way back, and that a way back built on someone else's goodwill was not a foundation you could trust. He started an insurance brokerage in 1962 with $4,000 borrowed from his mother. By 1980, it was regional. By 1990, it was one of the largest independent brokerages in the Southwest. He sold it in 1998 for $14.3 million, placed the proceeds into a trust, and spent the rest of his life doing exactly what he wanted, tending a cactus garden the size of a tennis court on his property outside Tucson and, every Sunday when I visited, teaching me to read financial statements at his kitchen table. He used a red pen. Never blue. Blue was for people who wanted to feel like nothing was wrong, he told me. Red was honest. I was 9 years old the first Sunday he put a balance sheet in front of me. I was 21 the last time I sat at that table, the November before he was diagnosed. By then, I could read a trust document faster than most people could read a menu, and I understood, genuinely understood, not just technically, the difference between what a number said and what it meant. Numbers don't lie, Claire Bear, he told me more times than I can count. People do. But numbers, you follow the numbers, they'll always take you somewhere true. He died in February 2019. Pancreatic cancer. 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which is how that disease works, quickly, without negotiation, with the particular cruelty of clarity. He was 87 years old, and his mind was sharp until the last 10 days, and in his final weeks he asked me to take over as co-administrator of the family trust alongside my father. Not Derek, who had an MBA and had been angling for trust involvement for years. Not my parents jointly, me specifically. His youngest grandchild. The one who had spent 12 years learning to read what numbers meant underneath what they said. I accepted. I didn't fully understand why he'd chosen me over Derek until 6 days after the funeral, when Dana called and asked me to come to her office. The document Dana showed me that afternoon was a supplemental trust instrument, for pages, notarized in November 2018, filed with the estate separately from the primary trust documents. It named me sole residual beneficiary of the trust's growth corpus. Not a proportional share, not equal distribution with my brother and parents, but the full growth above the trust's 1998 principal value, structured to distribute when I turned 35 or when the portfolio crossed $8 million, whichever came first. The portfolio was going to cross $8 million in approximately 18 months. I sat in Dana's office for a long time without speaking. Outside her window, Denver traffic moved in its ordinary Friday afternoon way, and I thought about the Sundays at my grandfather's kitchen table. I thought about the red pen. I thought about the November before the diagnosis. The last time I'd sat there, the way he'd paused at the end of the afternoon and looked at me for a moment longer than usual before saying, quietly, "You'll know what to do when the time comes, Claire Bear. You always did." I had assumed he meant my career. I understood now he meant something more specific. He had known what my father would do. He had known it with the clarity of a man who had watched his son for 60 years and loved him and had no illusions about him. He had spent the last year of his life building a legal structure designed to protect what he was leaving me, in the full knowledge that protection would be necessary. I did not tell my parents about the supplemental instrument. I did not tell Derek. I went home, made dinner, and called Dana the next morning to tell her I wanted everything documented and independent from the beginning. My relationship with my parents is not something I can reduce to a single story or a single failure. They are not people I can characterize simply because the truth of them is more complicated and more sad than that. My father is a man who was handed advantages by a successful father and experienced each one as validation of his own capability rather than his luck. He is not stupid. He is, in fact, genuinely intelligent, but his intelligence has always been in service of his self-image rather than the truth. He built a modest but real career in commercial real estate in Tucson, made his own money, and could have lived comfortably on it. But the trust was always there, and the trust was always larger than what he'd built himself, and I think that gap between his father's achievement and his own was something he carried constantly and quietly and never resolved. My mother is a woman who married a man she loved and then spent 35 years learning to not disagree with him, which is a different thing from agreeing. She is warm. She remembers birthdays and sends cards and asks the right questions about your life. She just doesn't do any of that independently of my father's framework. Derek, my brother, is 11 years older than me. He learned early that the way to succeed in our family was to perform ambition loudly and constantly, and he has done that his entire adult life. He has had 4 jobs in 12 years, each one described to the family as a promotion until it became clear it wasn't. He has borrowed money from my parents 7 times that I know of. He has never paid any of it back because it was never framed as a loan. It was framed as investment, as belief, as the family backing one of its own. My parents attended his quarterly earnings reviews like sporting events. My mother kept a photograph of his office corner office on her refrigerator. When he was passed over for a VP role in 2020 and quietly let go 3 months later, my father spent an entire Thanksgiving dinner explaining why the company had made a mistake, not Derek. I was the quiet one, the one who went away to college at 18 and did not come back to Tucson, who built something in a different city and described it in plain language when asked and in no language when not asked. When I signed my first federal compliance contract at 28, my father called it lucky government work. When I crossed $1 million in annual revenue at 29, my mother said that was wonderful and then turned to ask Derek about a new position he was interviewing for. When I turned 30 with 12 employees, a waiting list, and 2 contract renewals from federal credit unions, my father told his friend Carter at the anniversary dinner. I heard him clearly from across the table, over the sound of the string quartet my mother had hired, that I had done okay for myself in a niche market. I looked at my salmon. I noted it. I filed it. I stopped wanting their recognition sometime around 27, when I realized that recognition from them would require them to see me accurately, and seeing me accurately would require them to revise the story they had built about who was the capable one in the family. That revision was not available to them. Not because they were cruel, they weren't, not exactly, but because certain adjustments to self-image are simply not possible for certain people, and I had stopped being angry about it and started being clear-eyed about it, which is a different and more sustainable relationship with a truth you cannot change. What I did not stop doing was keeping records. Not from bitterness. I want to be precise about this because bitterness and documentation are easily confused. It was habit. The same habit my grandfather had built into me at that Sunday kitchen table. The same red pen practice of reading what a document meant underneath what it said. Every email from my father about the trust that contained an assumption I hadn't agreed to. Every phone call where he offered opinions about my business without my invitation. Every trust administration meeting where he made a unilateral decision and sent me the paperwork afterward as a courtesy rather than a consultation. Every countersignature I provided, with its corresponding memo noting what I had reviewed before signing. I filed everything in a system Dana helped me design in early 2019. She called it professional documentation practice, which was accurate. She also said, once, quietly, looking over the folder structure I'd created, "Your grandfather trained you well." She did not say anything beyond that.
She didn't need to.
We both understood what the files were for. The trust portfolio crossed $8 million in March 2023. Dana sent me the statement on a Tuesday afternoon. By Thursday, she had a letter prepared notifying my father, as the primary trust administrator, that the supplemental instruments trigger condition had been met and that distribution planning should begin. Routine language. 3 paragraphs. Entirely professional. My father called me Friday evening at 8:47 p.m. I still have the voicemail saved.
His voice was very calm.
The calmness of controlled anger rather than peace. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, Claire," he said. "Your grandfather built that trust for this family. Not for you to raid it while the rest of us get cut out. We're going to correct this." I listened to it twice. I noted the word raid. I noted that he did not dispute the existence of the supplemental instrument, only its validity in his worldview. I forwarded the voicemail to Dana. They filed suit 11 weeks later. The complaint was, I had to acknowledge, impressively constructed. Gerald Fitch had reviewed 4 years of trust transaction records and built a narrative around every legitimate administrative fee I had ever drawn as co-administrator, recharacterizing each one as a fraudulent transfer. His accounting was technically accurate, the transfers had occurred, the amounts were correct, but the characterization was false. Every fee had been authorized. Every authorization had been documented. Every document was in my files. The total he arrived at was $3.1 million, which was, as Marcus Webb pointed out to me when I showed him the complaint, almost precisely equal to the amount that had disappeared from the trust sub-account between November 2020 and August 2022. Marcus Webb is a forensic accountant based in Chicago who I hired in 2019, the same week I became co-administrator, to independently audit every transaction I touched in the trust. This was not dramatic foresight. It was the same instinct that had made me keep records for years before I had any specific reason to need them. You follow the numbers. You keep the documentation clean. You make sure that if you ever need to prove something, you can. Marcus and I had worked together for 4 years with no drama whatsoever. Quarterly reports. Clean audits. Routine correspondence. He sent me a card when my company hit its 5th anniversary. I sent him coffee from a Denver roaster he liked. That was the entirety of our relationship until I called him the afternoon the lawsuit landed. "I've been organizing the file since 2021, he told me. I asked him, why 2021? Because in October 2021, he said, a $340,000 transfer originated from a sub-account you weren't listed as co-administrator on, routed through a holding company I didn't recognize. I flagged it, documented it, and filed it.
I've been watching the account since then.
There are 4 more transfers after that one. Total, $1.94 million. All from accounts my father controlled exclusively. All routed through the same holding company. All predating the lawsuit by at least a year. Marcus flew to Denver 2 weeks before the trial date. We spent 6 hours at my kitchen table going through every page. My upstairs neighbor practiced piano badly through the ceiling. The same 4 bars of something classical, repeated with patient incompetence, stopping and starting at the same wrong note each time. Marcus drank 4 cups of coffee. I drank tea, and then water. He walked me through the full structure of what my father had done with the careful patience of someone who genuinely loves making complicated things legible, who finds the act of clarification its own reward regardless of what the clarity reveals. The structure was this. Beginning in November 2020, my father had used the sub-account, the one I was not listed as co-administrator on, the one my grandfather had structured for specific legacy expenses that rarely, if ever, triggered, to make a series of transfers. Small ones at first. $40,000, $60,000. Routed through the Nevada holding company that Marcus had traced, within a week of its appearance in the records, back to a registration filed in my father's name in September 2020. The holding company had one stated purpose: property investment. It had, as far as Marcus could determine, made no property investments. It had received $1.94 million from the trust and deployed it to 2 destinations: a personal brokerage account in my father's name and a series of payments to a private lending company that Marcus was still investigating. He needed the distribution not to happen, Marcus said, setting down his coffee mug. Once the supplemental instrument triggered and the audit process started, someone was going to look at the sub-account. He couldn't afford that, so he needed to make you the story instead of him. He filed the lawsuit to become the victim, I said. Before you could become the plaintiff, Marcus said. Yes. I thought about the November phone call. My father's calm voice. We're going to correct this. Not the voice of a man who felt wronged. I understood that now. The voice of a man who had already decided on his move and was announcing it. My father had been moving money out of the trust quietly for 2 years. When the supplemental instrument triggered and the distribution became imminent, he'd faced a choice: let the audit process begin, which would expose the withdrawals, or go on offense. The lawsuit was offense. By framing me as the one who had stolen from the trust, he could potentially discredit my documentation, tie up the distribution in litigation, and muddy the accounting trail before anyone followed it to its end. It was, I had to acknowledge, a reasonable plan against someone who wasn't prepared. I had been prepared since 2019. After Marcus left at midnight, I sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. The piano upstairs had stopped. The city was quiet. I looked at the cleared surface of the table, the rings from Marcus's coffee mugs, the single yellow legal pad where I had made notes in my own small handwriting as he walked me through the exhibits. I did not sleep well that night. Not from fear. I was not afraid of the outcome. From something heavier and more specific. The weight of understanding something you had suspected for years, but never let yourself fully name. I had known abstractly that my father was capable of this. I had built my documentation practice against the possibility without ever saying the possibility aloud. Now I had said it. The name fit the shape of what I'd been watching for 4 years. And naming it didn't diminish it or resolve it. It just made it real in a way that preparation, for all its practical value, cannot insulate you against. I had wanted to be wrong. I had spent 4 years hoping that the files would turn out to be unnecessary. Back to Courtroom 14. Back to the cufflinks. Gerald Fitch made his opening statement for 31 minutes. He was excellent. He moved through 4 years of transactions with the authority of someone who had memorized every page and trusted that opposing counsel had not. He used the word systematic 7 times. He used the phrase pattern of deception 4 times. He showed 2 charts on the courtroom display. Judge Harlan made careful notes. I watched my father's face during the opening. He was doing something I recognized, the performance of restraint. He kept his expression neutral and controlled, but every few seconds something passed through his eyes. Satisfaction, I thought. The satisfaction of a man who believes the structure he has built will hold. My mother stared at her hands. Dana's opening statement took 12 minutes. She used almost no adjectives. She said we would be introducing documentation. She said the court would find the full record instructive. She thanked the judge for his time and sat down. Fitch's first witness was his forensic accountant, a man named Pearson who had been engaged 6 weeks before trial. Pearson was polished and professional. He walked through his analysis on the display screen with the steady rhythm of someone accustomed to courtrooms, making each transaction sound obvious and damning. My father nodded at certain points, as though hearing confirmation of what he already knew. When Dana stood to cross-examine Pearson, she asked 3 questions. First, had he reviewed the supplemental trust instrument filed in November 2018? He had not. It had not been provided to him as part of his engagement. Second, had he reviewed the sub-account transaction records for the October 2021 transfer of $340,000? He had not. Those records hadn't been part of his scope. Third, had he reviewed the authorization memos for the administrative disbursements his analysis characterized as fraudulent? Pearson paused. He said he had reviewed some of them. Some, Dana said, exactly the way she would say it, quietly, without inflection, setting the word down like an object on a table. She sat down. The courtroom was very still for a moment. My father's expression had not changed, but I watched his hands, which were no longer quite as still as they had been. We broke for lunch. I ate a sandwich in the corridor with Dana and said very little. She ate quickly and reviewed notes. 2 floors below us, the building's atrium produced a constant low murmur of voices and footsteps that filtered up through the stairwell like water. I thought about my grandfather. I do that in difficult moments, not because I'm searching for comfort, exactly, but because he was the person in my life who made the most consistent sense, and sense is what I reach for when things become complicated. He had known. He had known what his son was, and he had loved him anyway, and he had also loved me enough to build a structure that would protect me from that love's limits. I thought about the November visit, the last Sunday at the kitchen table, the way he'd looked at me at the end of the afternoon. The red pen on the balance sheet. The cactus garden visible through the window. Everything in it spined and patient and prepared for conditions that would eventually arrive. He had spent his last good year making sure the numbers would tell the truth when it mattered. Marcus took the stand after lunch and stayed there for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He does not perform. That is the first thing you notice about Marcus Webb in a professional context. He has no theatrical register. He speaks at a consistent pace, uses precise language, and treats the documents in front of him with the careful attention of someone who regards accuracy as a moral commitment rather than a professional requirement. Juries like him. Judges like him. Even opposing counsel tends to like him, which is a rare quality. He walked through 4 years of trust records, exhibit by exhibit, with 340 pages of supporting documentation on the courtroom display system. The authorization memos for every administrative disbursement Fitch had characterized as fraudulent, each one countersigned by my father, date-stamped, filed in the system within 48 hours of the transaction. The sub-account records beginning October 2021. The $340,000 transfer. The holding company, registered in the state of Nevada, principal listed as Gerald Whitmore Jr., incorporation date September 2021, 1 month before the first transfer. 4 subsequent transfers. Total, $1.94 million. The quarterly audit reports Marcus had filed independently since 2019, predating the lawsuit by 4 years, with unbroken chain of custody documentation for every record, time-stamped and filed with a third-party archiving service that could not be altered retroactively. Fitch objected 11 times. Judge Harlan sustained 2 of them. My father's posture changed over those 2 hours and 40 minutes. I watched it happen with the detached attention of someone who has spent years reading the difference between what a number says and what it means. He had walked in this morning with the posture of a man certain of his structure. By the time Marcus finished his direct examination, my father was very still in the way that things become still when they are trying not to move. My mother had stopped pressing the tissue to her eye. During the afternoon recess, I walked to the window at the end of the corridor and looked at the parking garage across the street. Spring in Denver. The mountains faintly visible to the west between buildings, the sky the particular shade of pale blue that exists only at altitude. Dana came and stood beside me. "You doing okay?" she asked. "I keep thinking about his cufflinks," I said. She didn't ask me to explain. She knows my family well enough. She just nodded and looked out the window with me for a moment before putting her glasses back on and returning to her notes. I thought about a Sunday in 1998 when I was 9 years old and my grandfather had shown me my first balance sheet. I had asked him why some numbers were in parentheses. He had explained that parentheses indicated a loss, a subtraction, a withdrawal, something taken away from the total. I had asked him what happened when everything on the sheet was in parentheses. He had looked at me with the serious attention he always gave my questions, regardless of how small they were, and said, "Then someone made choices, Claire Bear. And now they're living inside them." Dana's closing argument took 18 minutes. She did not call my father dishonest. She did not characterize Fitch as negligent or the lawsuit as malicious. That would come, if it came, through the sanctions request, not through her closing. She walked through Marcus's testimony in sequence, citing each exhibit by number. She noted that the plaintiff's own expert had worked from an incomplete document set. She noted that every transaction characterized as fraudulent bore the plaintiff's countersignature in the original authorization records. She asked the court to dismiss the complaint with prejudice. She asked the court to consider sanctions. She sat down and removed her reading glasses. Fitch's rebuttal ran 9 minutes. He used systematic twice more, but the word had a different quality now, like a structure that had looked solid that morning, and was now showing the places where the load-bearing elements had been removed. There was something in his voice that had not been there at 9 a.m. Not doubt exactly. A kind of recalibration, the sound of a man revising his estimate of where he stood. Judge Harlan sat with the exhibits in front of him for a long time before speaking. When he did speak, he addressed Fitch directly, and his voice was entirely flat, the flatness of a man setting aside everything that isn't the document in front of him. "Counselor," he said, "are you aware that Exhibit 31, the authorization memo for the March 2021 administrative disbursement, bears your client's countersignature?" Fitch said he would need to review the exhibit. "It's on the screen," Judge Harlan said. The courtroom was silent long enough that I could hear the ventilation system cycling. Those had been the 2 words. Those were what I'd said when the judge asked me at the start of the morning session if I was prepared to proceed. Exhibit 31. Not a speech. Not a confrontation. 2 words and a folder and 4 years of clean records. Judge Harlan dismissed the complaint with prejudice that afternoon. He found that the plaintiff had filed a materially misleading claim based on selectively reviewed documentation that omitted authorization records bearing the plaintiff's own signature. He awarded costs to the defense. He imposed sanctions equal to 2/3 of the defense's legal fees, payable within 60 days. He referred the sub-account transfer records, the $1.94 million through the Nevada holding company, to the state attorney general's office for review, noting that the forensic evidence suggested potential breach of fiduciary duty and possible fraud. He said all of this in the same flat, drained voice, the voice of someone who has arrived somewhere he did not want to arrive and is conducting himself with discipline anyway. My father sat very still during the ruling.
He did not look at me.
When the judge finished and gathered his papers and left through the side door, my father remained seated for a moment with his hands flat on the table in front of him, looking at nothing I could identify. My mother looked at me once. It was a brief look, maybe 2 seconds. I have spent a lot of time since then trying to understand what it contained. Not guilt exactly. Guilt implies a recognition that arrives cleanly, and what I saw was older and more complicated than that. Something like the expression of a person who made a choice a long time ago and is only now, fully and without defense, understanding what the choice cost. I held her look. I did not smile or nod. I simply looked back. Then she turned away. Dana and I collected our materials in the quiet that follows courtroom rulings, everyone present engaged in the small physical tasks of putting papers in folders and folders in briefcases, the mundane machinery of departure. Fitch was speaking quietly to my father in a low, controlled voice. I could not hear the words. My father's back was to me. My mother was gathering her coat from the back of her chair, moving with the careful deliberateness of a person managing their expression. I did not look at them after that. I had looked at my mother when she looked at me, and that was enough. That was everything that needed to happen between us in that room. Dana and I walked out through the side corridor and down the stairs to the lobby. She pushed through the glass door into the afternoon and tilted her face toward the sun for a moment, which I had never seen her do before. "Good day's work," she said, which for Dana was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Thank you," I said. "For all of it. Since 2019. She looked at me briefly over her reading glasses, which she had replaced on her face sometime during our exit, with the expression she uses when she considers something obvious that other people treat as worth noting. "Your grandfather asked me to look after you," she said. That was a simple instruction. She shook my hand and walked to her car. In the parking lot, Marcus was waiting by his rental car with his briefcase balanced on the hood, squinting into the afternoon light. The mountains to the west were clear, the good visibility that comes in spring when the air is still clean before summer haze settles in. He had loosened his tie at some point. He looked like someone who had spent most of the day extremely focused and was now, with deliberate permission, releasing that focus. He shook my hand the way he always does, firm, brief, with the genuine warmth of a person who doesn't perform warmth because they don't need to. "Your grandfather would have liked today," he said. I thought about that. The cactus garden. The Sunday afternoons. The red pen. The way he always set the pen down completely when I asked a question, as though the question deserved his full physical attention, not just the part of his brain that wasn't still writing. "He would have liked the exhibit numbers," I said. "Especially 31. Marcus laughed. It was a clean, uncomplicated sound in the afternoon air, the laugh of a person who has done something difficult well and is simply glad about it. 31 was a good one, he agreed. He shook my hand again, picked up his briefcase, and got in his rental car. I watched him pull out of the lot and then stood there for another moment in the afternoon light. I drove home with the windows down. The Subaru needed an oil change. The reminder light had been amber for 6 weeks. I made a note to schedule it Monday. The radio was on, something I didn't recognize and didn't try to identify, and Denver moved past me in the ordinary way cities move past you when you have been through something real and are still in the middle of being a person in the world. I did not call anyone that evening. I made pasta, nothing elaborate, the kind of meal you make when you want the comfort of doing something simple with your hands. I sat at the kitchen table alone. The same table where Marcus and I had spread 340 pages 2 weeks ago, where we had stayed until midnight reconstructing everything my father had done. The table was clean now. The chair across from mine was empty. The trust distribution would begin in 60 days. There would be more attorneys, more documentation, more careful steps through a process that my grandfather had built to be followed precisely. And at the end of it, a number would arrive in my account that was mine by law and by the choice of a man who had sat at a different kitchen table 40 years ago and decided that what he was building was worth protecting carefully. He had known what was coming. He had spent the last year of his life making sure it couldn't be taken from me. That was the gift, not the money, but the preparation. The red pen, the documentation habit, the knowledge that numbers take you somewhere true if you follow them all the way. I thought about the cufflinks again. My father giving them to Judge Harlan at the anniversary dinner. The warmth in his voice when he'd said 35 years of friendship. I'd wrapped the box and tied the ribbon, and I'd watched him hand it across the table, and I'd understood even then, at 19, without the specific vocabulary for it, that my father's warmth was a form of positioning, that his generosity was always an investment, that the people he chose to be generous toward were the people he might someday need. I had understood it. I had filed it away without quite naming it. And then I had built my life in a different city, following the numbers, keeping the records, preparing without fully knowing I was preparing. He had made me into his own defense. He had just never understood that. I finished my dinner. I washed my plate. I went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept the flat, dreamless sleep of someone who has been through something real and come out the other side of it intact. Outside, Denver carried on. Traffic. Someone's music from 3 floors up. The ordinary, indifferent noise of a city that does not adjust itself to what any one person has been through. I did not feel triumphant.
I want to be clear about that.
I felt something quieter and more permanent than triumph. The particular stillness of a person who followed the numbers all the way to the end and found exactly what they were afraid they'd find, and faced it anyway, and now has to continue living in a world where their father is a man who did what he did, and their mother is a woman who chose what she chose, and neither of those things is going to resolve into something clean. My grandfather knew that feeling. He had lived with the knowledge of his son for 60 years, and he had loved him, and he had also protected what mattered from him. That was not a contradiction. That was just the full complexity of a long life with the people you came from. I thought about what he'd told me. Numbers don't lie. I know. I know they don't. I just wish sometimes that they did.